Arizona, August 1944. The air shimmered with heat. Dust settled into every breath, every pore. Fort Sommers was a skeleton of corrugated tin and barbed wire, humming beneath the sun. The smell of burnt wire drifted through the yard, faint, metallic, like memory. I stood by the outer fence with tongs in one hand and a slab of meat in the other. Behind the wire, 300 prisoners stared back, sunburned, hollow-eyed, silent. They refused to work. They refused to speak. And yet, smoke rose from the barrel in front of me. A private whispered to another guard, "What the hell is he doing?" No one answered. I turned the meat over once, slow and deliberate. Fat hissed against iron. Then, from the other side of the fence, a voice called out, hesitant, cracked by weeks of dust and pride. "What is that smell?" That question started everything. They called it Fort Sommers, though there was no fort, just wire, towers, and sun-cooked corrugate halfway between Tucson and El Paso. The map said, PW enclosure, neat black letters on tan paper. The wind said sand and static. The ground said stay awake. On paper, we followed the Geneva Convention. Calorie tables were posted in the mess, 3,200 per man in heat, bread weight listed to the ounce. Twice a week the Red Cross truck rattled in with soap and books. Medical inspected gums, logged temperatures. Chaplain read a prayer outside the wire, careful not to meet any eyes. The guards drilled, the bugle called, the roll was counted. That was the system. It worked until it didn't. Unofficially, we were losing. Not to hunger, not to heatstroke, though August tried its best, but to will. The prisoners refused labor details, refused to answer by number, refused even to take the soup if an American served it. Bowls came back full, spoons dry. When they did eat, they lined up in silence, hands to the seams, faces forward, as if we were the enemy of physics itself. Sabotage rode in on every delivery. A pump gasket walked out of the tool cage. A laundry boiler cracked after someone salted the feed water. A field oven lost its draft because a brick had been tapped a quarter-inch off center and mortared smooth. We logged it all, Form 19B, malfunction, and pretended coincidence. At night, pamphlets appeared in the barracks, tidy Gothic script arguing for home, honor, inevitable victory by miracle P*N. In daylight, a cadre of true believers paced the wire like metronomes, eyes harder than the sun, teeth too clean. They preached defiance as if it nourished bone. Lectures failed. We brought in a major with a chalkboard and a stack of maps. He walked through Normandy inches at a time and drew arrows westward. The prisoners stared past him at the horizon, where heat made the mountains swim. Threats failed. Lockdown only taught their silence to deepen. The commander's voice lost its edge. Morale bled out of the posts like sap. The War Department wanted order. Headquarters sent memoranda, increase productive employment of PW labor. Maintain discipline without undue severity. Avoid fraternization. The last line came underlined twice. Do not fraternize with the enemy. We all knew it by heart. The wire was not just metal, it was doctrine. I was the mess sergeant, not a psychologist. I signed for flour, not souls. I managed temperatures, meat safe at 165 degrees Fahrenheit, milk kept cold with melting ice in a canvas cooler that leaked down the gravel like a thin white river. I counted sacks, sharpened knives, cleaned burners fouled by desert dust. The system trusted calories and schedules to mend what bombs had broken. But the numbers were wrong. Men cannot be reasoned into hunger. They cannot be threatened into appetite. From day one I felt it, the distance was not yards of barbed wire but smell. Our food had no history to them. It came on steel, not in memory. They would starve on pride before they'd swallow our taste of home. You could hear it in the way they refused to say, coffee, as if the vowel itself were treason. I tried talking at the serving hatch. Mornin', I said, plain. Nothing. I tried handing a heel of bread with the crust still warm. A young one looked at the sky and let it fall. Don't bother, the lieutenant told me. They're the enemy. He meant it kindly, as a shield against disappointment. Enemy. The word sat heavy, tasted like tin. At reveille, I watched them stand as one, tired, bitter, unbroken. At taps, I watched them lie as one, backs to us, a single machine of refusal. Between those hours was sand, orders, and the noise of evaporative coolers coughing through the afternoon. Systems run on compliance. Ours ran on heat and habit and the assumption that time would grind resistance down to powder. Time failed. Heat did not. "They're not broken," I told Corporal Morgan while we humped crates of onions into shade. "They just don't see us as people." He wiped his neck and squinted at the wire. "We're not supposed to be," he said. I looked at the mess schedule, the ration sheets, the posted rules. I smelled the camp, sun on tin, hot creosote, a trace of burnt insulation from a fan motor that had died at noon. I thought about the one lever we hadn't pulled because it wasn't in any manual. Not argument. Not punishment. Smell. Before the war, I was nobody special, just a farm mechanic from outside Enid, Oklahoma, where the wind never stopped talking and every nail was half rusted before you drove it in. My world was dust, diesel, and habit. If it had gears, I could fix it. If it didn't, I'd find a way to make it turn. I grew up fixing what shouldn't run anymore: tractors cannibalized from two brands, a truck missing half its bolts, a pump that rattled like a box of wrenches. My father used to say, "You can't fix people, Roy, but you can fix the things they break." I learned that was close to the truth. Close, but not all of it. By the time I was 25, I was the man neighbors called when their thresher coughed black smoke or their windmill refused to spin. I kept my tools clean, my boots dusty, and my coffee black. I had a younger brother, Joe. He was faster than me, louder, a ballplayer who thought grease under the fingernails was a kind of shame. He joined the infantry in 42. Italy took him in 43. They sent me his watch, stopped at 9:12. I never wounded again. People expected hate to follow loss. It didn't. It just left a hollow place that meals couldn't fill. So I cooked instead of talking. I roasted to remember him, the smell of mesquite, the hiss of fat, the slow patience of coals. On Sundays, I fed the whole road. Sometimes the Baptists, sometimes the Methodists, sometimes just whoever smelled the smoke. My rule was simple: you can't fix hate, but you can feed a man. When the draft came, they looked at my hands, saw grease instead of polish, and said, "Mechanic." I told them I could cook, too. The Army, in its strange wisdom, made me both. They put me in a kitchen unit that traveled with motor pools, half cook, half grease monkey. I'd change a spark plug with one hand and stir stew with the other. By 43 I was in North Africa, cooking for men who hadn't seen rain in months. You learn quick that a hot meal is the difference between obedience and despair. I watched fights die down over a pot of beans. I saw a man write his wife a letter because he smelled onions frying and remembered Sunday back home. War makes strange alchemy: turn hunger into memory and you get peace for a minute. They said cooks don't fight, but we fought every day, against spoilage, sand, and indifference. Against officers who thought morale was a word you could issue like ammunition. Once in Tunisia our convoy took shellfire. I spent the next morning hauling ruined cans out of the wreckage, scraping mud off labels, and making stew from what survived. When the men ate, they stopped shaking. One corporal said, "Sergeant, this tastes like home." That was all the medal I ever wanted. In the spring of 44 they shipped me stateside, rotation for stateside service. That's what the papers said. Truth was, I was worn down to the threads. They sent me to Arizona because the desert looked like North Africa and because the Army believed I'd be harmless there. A mess sergeant in a prisoner of war camp. Safe duty. No combat. Just recipes and discipline. Fort Sommers was waiting, a camp filled with men who had once driven tanks under Hitler's flag and now stared through wire at a cook who smelled of smoke and onions. I arrived with a trunk of knives, a dented coffee pot, and one rule in my head: feed first, talk later. The officers joked right away. "Campbell," they said, "you're barbecue with a uniform." I didn't mind. The truth was in the smoke. You can't teach respect with a bayonet, but you can start it with a scent that reminds a man of his mother's kitchen. I was 32 then, older than most, slower than some, but steady. I had no ambitions left but to make things run: engines, tempers, systems. I didn't come to Fort Sommers to change policy or win medals. I came to measure flour, boil coffee, and keep the men from going hungry. But hunger comes in more than one kind. And before the summer was out, I'd learned that sometimes the only tool that matters isn't a wrench or a ladle. It's the nerve to decide that orders are suggestions when humanity is at stake. One day, that same barbecue man they joked about would end a mutiny without a *P***N, only smoke, salt, and logic. I didn't plan it. I just followed the one lesson the farm taught better than any sergeant ever could. If the machine won't turn, change what feeds it. The first week I kept my head down and my ladle steady. Feed, count, clean. That was the rhythm. But I saw it right away: the prisoners weren't starving from hunger, they were starving from pride. They took food like it was poison, eyes flat, jaws set. The bread hardened untouched. Coffee cooled to tar. It wasn't about taste. It was about surrender. They weren't eating American. They were resisting it. The camp commander thought discipline would wear them thin. He quoted regulations, double-posted guards, scheduled work details with mathematical precision. He said, "Time breaks the will." But the men behind the wire didn't live by time anymore. They lived by defiance. Every rule we enforced fed them. Every order proved their strength. I learned their pattern fast. At dawn they lined up without being told. At inspection, they faced the sun in perfect silence. At meals, they refused utensils and waited until the food cooled, small protests wrapped in obedience. To them, we were chaos. America was noise, jazz, slang, improvisation. They were order. They were rhythm. And their silence was the last uniform they still wore. I tried to talk once. A simple thing, handing over a bowl of stew through the serving hatch. "Morning," I said. "Hot meal." A young prisoner looked at me, then turned his head slightly, as if listening to something far away. He didn't move his hands. Didn't blink. Behind him, another whispered a word: "Shand." Shame. He left the bowl untouched. The lieutenant told me to stop wasting effort. "You're not here to make friends. They'll eat when they're hungry enough." But I'd worked with engines long enough to know hunger isn't the same as fuel. Pride burns slower. They kept to themselves. Even the ones too tired to stand straight followed the same ritual: straighten coat, chin up, no eye contact. 1,000 little gestures of resistance. At night, they sang soft, low hymns in German that rolled through the barracks like fog. The guards hated it. I didn't. There was order in it, something I understood. Rhythm again, precise, cold, disciplined. Once, I caught a glimpse of their leader, tall, thin, silver hair combed straight back. His name was Kraus, a former engineer from Stuttgart. He carried himself like a man still at work. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just looked. And the others moved. He was building something invisible: control. We tried breaking it with comfort. Added sugar to the rations, white bread instead of rye. They rejected both. They wanted the past, not charity. So I did what cooks do when logic fails: I started watching noses. Every afternoon the desert wind shifted. It carried the smell from the motor pool, from burnt oil, from dust heated to copper. The prisoners wrinkled their faces, turned away. But when we roasted meat for the guards, something happened. Heads lifted. Just a second, just an instinct. The smell crossed the wire like a message no language could block. It was faint: pepper, fat, smoke. Familiar enough to break posture, then gone. That's when the idea started to form. Not from books. Not from pity. From smell. The Army's rule said nothing about scent. They could measure distance, calories, manpower, not aroma. If words failed, maybe smoke could talk. I told Corporal Morgan one night, while we were scrubbing the kettles. "They're not broken," I said. "They just don't see us as people." He grinned, tired. "You planning to teach them manners?" "No," I said. "Just appetite." He didn't understand. Maybe I didn't either, not yet. But every system has a pressure point. I'd spent my life finding them, the bolt you loosen to fix a jam, the vent that stops a boiler from bursting. This camp was no different. Rules held it together. Rules also strangled it. And sometimes the only fix was the one that wasn't allowed. I went back to my quarters, the smell of soap still on my hands, and thought about the space between order and hunger. Somewhere in that space was a lever. I just had to find it. The desert doesn't forgive carelessness. By the middle of August, the sun burned through every canvas roof, and the air itself turned metallic. The thermometers in the mess shed stopped at 110 degrees and climbed anyway. Flies died on the walls. The men's tempers followed. That morning started with the smell of burnt insulation. One of the storage sheds, Building 9, marked perishables only, had caught fire. A shorted fan motor, they said. By the time I reached it, the roof was already sagging, tin hissing like wet paper. Inside, sacks of flour flared white and quick. Cans split open. Oil ran in bright rivers that caught flame like gasoline. The alarm bell stuttered once, then jammed. Guards shouted. Prisoners crowded behind the wire, faces expressionless. The commander barked orders, too many, too late. We needed water, shovels, hands. But when I yelled across the fence for help, no one moved. Not one of them. Kraus stood in front of the others, arms crossed, expression calm. I could almost hear his thoughts, not our duty. The lieutenant beside me cursed. Let it burn, he said. We'll rebuild. But I was watching more than flame. I was watching a chance, thin, dangerous, but real. Fire strips away pretense faster than words. If the camp was ever going to break, it would break now. I grabbed a shovel and ran anyway. The heat hit like a hammer. Morgan followed, shirt over his mouth, eyes squinting through the smoke. The roof gave a sound like thunder. We fell back, coughing black. Behind the wire, silence. Then someone laughed, short, sharp, proud. One of the prisoners, amused at our struggle. That sound cut through more than the smoke. By noon the fire was out, leaving the shed a skeleton. We lost half our week's rations. Command took photographs, wrote reports, talked of requisitions. The official cause, electrical failure. The unofficial cause, everything that wasn't working. That night, I sat by the fence, watching the embers fade. The desert cooled fast after dark, you could smell rust and dust settling together. I thought of the rulebook stacked on the commander's desk, pages that told us what not to do, who not to speak to, what not to share. None of it had stopped the fire. The next day the temperature climbed again. The air shimmered like boiling water. I stood in the motor pool, wiping sweat, when I noticed the old fuel truck sitting by the fence, an obsolete tanker we'd gutted months ago. Just a hollow cylinder of steel, half buried in sand. I remember saying it out loud, barely a whisper, if orders won't work, maybe smoke will. Morgan heard me. What kind of smoke? The kind that eats through silence. He laughed, but I wasn't joking. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that laugh behind the wire, the contempt in it, and the way every man, guard or prisoner, had watched the fire and done nothing. We were all trapped by the same invisible order, do only what's allowed. The army had its rules. The prisoners had theirs. Both were *ling us slow. Around midnight I walked back to the fence. The sky was heavy with stars, no moon, just wind. I listened to the camp breathe, distant snoring, a guard's boot crunching gravel, the soft clank of chain on a flagpole. In the dark, the old tanker glinted faintly. I kicked the sand off its side, checked the welds, measured its balance. The shape was right. The metal was thick. All it needed was air, heat, and patience. I thought about the smell of hickory, about how it moved through air like a ghost. You didn't see it, you felt it first, in your stomach, in your throat, in the part of the brain that remembers safety. I could make that here. Not hickory, maybe mesquite or scrap wood from the carpenter shed. Firewood wasn't contraband. Cooking wasn't rebellion. Not yet. By dawn, the plan was clear: a barrel, a handful of spices from the commissary, a few cuts of meat. Nothing dangerous. Nothing the manuals could forbid by name. Only one problem remained: the line between feeding and fraternizing. I knew what crossing it would cost. Stripped rank, maybe prison. Maybe worse if anyone decided to make an example. But I'd seen the camp's true enemy, and it wasn't Germany. It was inertia. And sometimes the only way to save a system is to violate it completely. So I waited for nightfall, listened to the hum of the desert, and planned the first act of disobedience that would smell like salvation. That night the desert wind came low and steady, cool enough to breathe again. The moon was thin, a blade of silver cutting through cloud. I rolled the old tanker from the fence line to the open yard, careful not to wake the guard in Tower 3. The sand whispered under its weight. When metal met stone, it made a dull, honest sound, the kind a mechanic trusts. I stacked 4 bricks beneath one end to give it tilt, punched vent holes with a hammer, and filled the base with mesquite scrap from the carpenter's shop. The wood was dry as bone, streaked with resin. It would smoke, not flame. That was the point. Morgan found me halfway through. "What the hell are you doing, Sarge?" he hissed. "An experiment," I said. "With morale." He shook his head but stayed. Every man needs a witness, even for heresy. We worked in silence. The first match flared bright, then died in the wind. The second caught. The third built smoke. Soon the barrel breathed, thin blue ribbons rising like ghosts through the vents. The smell came slow, deep, unmistakable: pepper, salt, mesquite, a whisper of grease. By 0400 the first guard arrived, drawn like a moth. He stopped 10 feet away, rifle low. "Regulations say no open flame after lights out." "Write it up," I said, turning the meat with tongs. "What meat?" "Whatever the supply truck forgot to count." He hesitated. The smoke got him next, his stomach growled loud enough to answer for him. At dawn the camp woke to a smell no report could forbid. The air carried it across the wire, through every barack, into every stubborn chest. Prisoners stirred. Some coughed, pretending not to notice. Others stood at the fence, eyes narrowed, nostrils flaring like animals catching the scent of something half-remembered. I flipped the slab once more, slow and deliberate. Fat hissed, coals popped. The sound was alive, human. From the guard post came laughter. Sergeant's lost his mind, feeding ghosts. Maybe I had. But ghosts eat, too. Then it happened, the thing no officer, no manual, no strategy had managed. From the far side of the wire, a voice rose in halting English. "What is that?" The same question that had started it all. I turned the tongs toward the sound. "Barbecue," I said. "Want a piece?" Gasps followed. Orders forbade contact. The fence was law. And yet a dozen men leaned closer, eyes on the smoke curling upward. I tore a strip of meat, laid it on a tin plate, and slid it under the lowest strand of wire. The guard behind me muttered a warning. I ignored him. The prisoner hesitated, then took it. He didn't thank me. He didn't smile. He just chewed, slow, thoughtful. Then another came. And another. That morning I broke the army's most sacred rule. Word spread faster than punishment. By noon, 20 prisoners lingered near the fence while I worked the barrel. They didn't speak, but they stayed. The smell did the talking. When the lieutenant arrived, red-faced, shouting about regulations, I handed him a plate. "You want this problem fixed?" I said quietly. "Let it breathe." He didn't eat, but he didn't shut me down either. Maybe he was tired of silence too. That evening, I built a second fire, smaller, sanctioned by nobody. The guards pretended not to see. The prisoners pretended not to wait. Smoke rose steady into the dusk, mixing with the desert's own. By the third day, the lines blurred. A few prisoners offered to haul wood, claiming it was to keep the mess from wasting fuel. One of them, Kraus, the engineer, inspected my rig with professional interest. "You built this?" he asked in careful English. "Rebuilt it," I said. He nodded once, respectful. Efficient draft. It was the first compliment I'd heard in weeks. That night, I knew there was no going back. Fraternization, the code called it. To me, it was combustion, two sides feeding on the same air until smoke became the only language we both understood. I should have been afraid. I wasn't. I was curious how far scent could travel before orders caught up. As the last light died, I added one more piece of mesquite and watched the smoke drift toward the barracks. It didn't ask permission. Neither did I. The next morning, before reveille, the camp already smelled different. Not the sour tang of disinfectant or the dry bite of dust, but something softer, char, salt, smoke caught in canvas. The guards noticed first. They came to the yard pretending to check the trucks, but really to see if I'd do it again. I did. This time, I didn't hide it. I set the barrel in the open, stacked the wood slow, steady. No one gave permission, no one stopped me. The air was cool enough to hold scent low to the ground. When the first curl of smoke drifted through the wire, heads turned like compass needles. At 0600, 3 prisoners approached the fence. They didn't speak. They stood, waiting, as if waiting were permission enough. I handed each a plate through the lowest strand. They ate in silence, standing shoulder to shoulder, eyes closed just long enough to remember something that wasn't war. By noon, there were 10. By dusk, 20. The next day, more. They came with small offerings, peeled potatoes, chopped onions, flour they'd found in a storage shed. Technically, it was labor. Technically, it was cooperation. Officially, no one was supposed to notice. The lieutenant did, of course. He walked the line with his hands clasped tight behind his back. "You're building something dangerous, Campbell," he said. "Depends what you mean by dangerous," I replied. He didn't answer, but he didn't order me to stop. Perhaps he understood that peace, like meat, required slow fire. The camp changed first in sound. Less shouting. Fewer boots striking gravel in anger. The guards stopped treating the prisoners like statues, the prisoners stopped staring like ghosts. They started helping, small things at first. Hauling crates. Mending screens. Cleaning the kitchen gutters. Work voluntarily rendered, as the reports would phrase it. The command logs began to shift. Behavior improving. Cleanliness satisfactory. Morale, high. The colonel from Tucson sent a telegram, "Continue current practices." He never asked what those were. Not everyone approved. A few of the hardliners, American and German alike, saw treason in every spark. One night, someone kicked over the barrel. Another night, they doused it in sand and left a note, "No smoke with the enemy." I read it once, folded it, and built a new pit from scrap tin. "You can burn steel," I told Morgan, "but not the smell." When the fire lit again, more prisoners came than before. Even Kraus, the old engineer, helped bolt the frame. "Better draft this way," he said. His English was smoother now. He'd started using our words, and a few guards had started using his. Within 2 weeks, the camp that had once been a locked machine began to turn on its own. The fences didn't change, but what they held did. The Red Cross inspectors wrote "Model Conduct Camp" in their notebook, puzzled by the calm. Washington sent polite inquiries for training notes we didn't have. At night, I'd sit by the dying coals and listen. The prisoners talked now, not loudly, but enough. Some told stories about their homes, their wives, the engines they'd built before the war. Others asked for recipes. I learned that in Saxony they used mustard seed instead of pepper, that Bavarian smokehouses used beechwood for flavor. We traded knowledge the way other men traded ammunition. Quietly, precisely, without signatures. The guards began to drift closer too. They'd come under the pretense of checking supplies, then linger with plates in their hands. Smoke didn't care about sides, it treated everyone equal. The camp's hierarchy, prisoner, guard, officer, cook, blurred in the heat. Not gone, but softened. And yet, beneath it all, tension waited. There were still men who believed peace was a form of weakness. They watched me from shadow, lips tight, eyes cold. When the first act of disobedience becomes success, it earns both loyalty and hatred. But for a few weeks in that scorched August, order didn't come from the rulebook. It came from the fire pit. And though nobody wrote it down, everyone could smell it, the new law of Fort Sommers. Where there is smoke, there is calm. Even Washington could sense it from afar, in numbers, in graphs, in the sudden absence of trouble reports. They never knew why. They didn't need to. Because by then, the wind carried proof. By September, the desert began to cool. Even the air had changed, less biting, less full of resentment. The guards stopped shouting during roll call, the prisoners stopped counting seconds between commands. Something had shifted, invisible but steady, like a gear finally finding its teeth. The War Department called Fort Sommers stabilized. The report spoke of voluntary labor participation, reduced disciplinary incidents, model integration. None of those words mentioned the smoke, or the barrel, or the man who kept it burning. But everyone inside the wire knew. They came now without fear, dozens at a time. They built benches from salvaged wood, carved spoons from scrap pine, even erected a small shade roof beside the pit. I never asked for help, they just appeared, quiet and precise. The same men who once sabotaged water pumps were now repairing stoves, sweeping mess halls, and arguing cheerfully about spice ratios. It felt wrong to call them prisoners anymore. They were still behind wire, but their eyes had changed. The arrogance was gone. So was the bitterness. In its place, a strange calm. One afternoon, Kraus, the engineer, brought me something wrapped in cloth. Inside was a hand-carved wooden spoon, the handle etched with a simple pattern of lines. For balance, he said. I turned it over in my hands. You make this? He nodded. Old habit. When you build something, you give it part of yourself. He said it softly, almost ashamed of the sentiment. I kept that spoon. Still have it. That night, they found him. It happened after lights out, in Barrack 4. The guards heard shouting first, then silence, then the sound of boots retreating fast. When I arrived, Kraus was on the floor, blood on his temple, 2 ribs broken. The camp medic did what he could. Kraus wouldn't say who attacked him, but we all knew. The hardliners. The true believers who couldn't stand what the smoke had done to their war. By morning, something extraordinary happened. The men of Barrack 4 came to the gate and demanded to speak to the guards. No one had ever seen that before, Germans asking for American help. They handed over 3 names. The attackers were brought out in silence, their faces pale, defiant. Kraus, still bandaged, limped to the fence and spoke just once, I choose smoke over fear. That sentence hung in the air longer than the fire ever did. That day, the underground resistance, the quiet network that had ruled the camp through threats and memory, died. Not by punishment, but by rejection. The commander called me into his office that evening. He didn't look angry. Just tired. You realize, he said, that none of this will ever make a report. I figured, I told him. He rubbed his eyes. You broke half the regulations in the book. But you saved this place. I just cooked, sir. He shook his head. You did more than that. You made them see us. He opened a folder on his desk, scribbled a line across the top, and stamped it transfer for rest. It was the Army's way of saying thank you without admitting why. When I walked out, the wind had shifted again. The smell of mesquite clung to the fences, soaked into the boards, into the uniforms, into everything that used to separate us from them. For days afterward, the camp stayed unnaturally quiet. Not out of tension, but reflection. Men who once prayed for Germany now prayed for the wounded. Guards who once spat toward the barracks now nodded when they passed. Even the desert seemed gentler, as if it understood that something had finally burned clean. I left Fort Sommers a week later. The fire was still smoking when the truck pulled away. Morgan stood by the barrel, waving with his cap. The prisoners lined the fence, not as soldiers or captives, but as men who'd shared the same air. No one saluted. No one spoke. Only the smell followed us down the road, thin, steady, unashamed. That was the last I saw of the camp. But years later, when I read in some report that Fort Sommers was being decommissioned, I could still picture the spoon in my pocket, its grain darkened by smoke and time. That was the proof, not in medals, not in orders, but in the quiet fact that a man once beaten for peace had taught others to choose it. Smoke had done what sermons couldn't. It had ended a war inside the wire. After the armistice, the army turned its machine inward: records, debriefs, signatures, silence. Fort Sommers faded from the reports like a smudge erased by policy. They transferred me to Fort Bliss for rest and reassignment, though everyone knew it was exile by another name. No one wanted the story of fraternization in the official archive. By December 1945, I was home again, Oklahoma flatland, windmills creaking, the same porch with the same broken step. The war had ended overseas, but the noise still lived inside me. The smell of hot dust and wire never quite left my clothes. I unpacked one trunk, the wooden spoon from Krauss, my canteen, a service photo the army forgot to stamp. Everything else I left behind. No medals. No commendations. Just a letter from the quartermaster thanking me for culinary service rendered under difficult conditions. It didn't mention that the conditions included 300 enemy soldiers and one forbidden fire. I opened a small roadside diner outside Enid, a square shack with a rusted sign and 4 stools. I called it Roy's Smokehouse, half joke, half confession. Customers were truckers, farmers, drifters. They came for the smell long before they saw the building. Every morning, I lit mesquite like it was ritual. I still used the old trick from Fort Sommers: vent holes tilted to draw the draft east, coals banked shallow, slow-burning fat for sweetness. Cooking was rhythm. It kept my hands busy when memory wanted to talk too loud. For years, no one asked about the war. And I didn't tell. You learn, after certain things, that silence is easier than translation. How do you explain that a fire fed peace better than punishment? That the rule you broke was the only one that mattered? Now and then, letters arrived, thin airmail envelopes with unfamiliar stamps, written in careful English. The first came in 47. It started simply. "We refuse to work until you fired up the barbecue." Signed by 30 men from the old camp. They wrote that they'd gone home, scattered across Germany, Austria, even Poland. Some were farmers again, some mechanics. A few had opened cafes. One wrote, "I still use mesquite when I can find it. My neighbors say it smells like America." Another enclosed a photograph, a wooden sign reading Rochhaus Roy, hung over a door in Stuttgart. I read those letters at the counter while the smoker hummed outside. Sometimes I'd smile, sometimes not. The past has a way of staying hot long after the coals should die. In 1952, a man stepped out of a gray Chevrolet and stood in my doorway. He wore a suit too fine for Oklahoma and spoke with a faint accent. It was Krauss. Older, thinner, walking with a cane. He ordered brisket and black coffee. When he finished, he said quietly, "They told me you saved lives with smoke. I tell them you saved language. We didn't shake hands. We didn't have to." He left that spoon behind, polished smooth from use. On the handle, he'd carved new words: Frieden braucht Feuer, peace needs fire. The diner stayed open for 30 more years. Travelers came and went, chasing the same scent across the highway. I grew older, slower, quieter. The newspapers wrote about generals, campaigns, medals. They never wrote about the fence, or the smell that ended a mutiny. That was fine. History favors thunder, smoke leaves no echo. Sometimes a veteran would stop by, glance at the photographs on the wall, and ask if I'd been over there. I'd nod once and change the subject. Only once did I tell the whole story, late one night to a young boy sweeping the floor. He asked why I cooked every day even when no customers came. I told him, because somewhere, someone's still hungry for peace, and it always starts with a smell. He didn't understand, not then. Maybe he will someday. Years later, when I was old and the diner empty, I kept one last letter in the register. It was from a man named Joseph from Dresden. We built a small shop. My son calls it Roy's Smokehouse. We serve both Americans and Germans. They eat together. Sometimes, when the fire burns right, I can almost see Arizona in the smoke. I folded the paper, placed it beside Krauss's spoon, and locked the door for the last time. The fire went out that night, but the air stayed sweet. Because peace, I learned, doesn't march in uniform. It rises quiet, gray, unrecorded. And it smells of mesquite. He never carried a rifle. He never made a speech. He stood in heat and dust, turning meat over a barrel while two nations watched from opposite sides of wire. No fanfare, no command. Just instinct, the kind that listens to silence and decides it's time to breathe again. They refused to work until he lit the fire. They refused to speak until the smoke spoke first. Years later, the wars ended, the records yellowed, and no report mentioned Fort Sommers or the cook who broke a rule. But every man who smelled that fire remembered. Because sometimes victory doesn't begin with a bullet. It begins with smoke. A thin line rising through desert air. Carrying peace where orders never could.